Welcome to this week's edition of the Webster Tarpley Program. And that is yours truly, Webster Tarpley, speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And as soon as this music quiets down, if that's what we can call it, we'll get on to our strategic briefing of the week here on Unbound Radio. And the principal question, of course, is what should you be doing? How should you be mobilizing, right? Not sitting in your easy chair or squatting vulgarly outside of the universe of discourse, but what to do. And it comes down to something very simple. The principal priority right now is one. It is to stop the attack on Syria, to prevent the imminent U.S. war with Syria. And this is a war which could be ordered by Obama, or, let's be frank, it could be something that takes place without Obama even knowing that it's going to start. Remember the infamous bombing of Serbia in 1999, ordered by Al Gore in a kind of a palace coup. And as I said, we're trying to figure out what happened there with Libya in 2011, around the middle of March 2011, when the word from Washington was no, 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 and then somehow it became, yes, let the bombing begin, and Sarkozy was way out in front jumping the gun. Very suspicious case. So you're now on the verge of something much worse, believe it or not, than any of that. A glance at the proceedings in Northern Ireland over the last couple of days, the meeting of the Group of Seven, Group of Eight, the Group of Seven Western countries, NATO, U.S., British puppets, what have you, and then, of course, Putin being there providing the antidote. If you look at that, look at those proceedings, you will see that the entirety of world politics currently aligns around this Syria question. So what are you doing about that? And have you allowed yourself to be diverted by the latest covert operation? And this is the tragedy of the current situation is that starting around 9/11, we had a body of opinion, we had a body of broadcasters and other people trying to shape public opinion who could be relied on to oppose the covert operations that came down the pike. Unfortunately, a lot of those, tragically, were sucked into the Rand Paul reactionary, proto-fascist Republican machine. And as a result of that, they are intellectually, morally crippled, politically crippled, to the point where there are now many covert operations which they are willing to approve, to support. Right, the Benghazi stunt to begin with. In other words, the hatred of Obama has grown to be so consuming that many of them are willing to go along with obvious covert operations, obvious frauds, because these are somehow designed to cause trouble for Obama. And there are lots of them, Benghazi and others. And now we've got Ed Snowden, the new hero, the new culture hero for the millennials and for the aging boomers and for any silence that are around. Ed Snowden. So we're going to demystify this today here on the Webster Tarpley Program. Unbound Radio, back in just a couple of seconds after the break. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program. So we're talking about the world strategic situation as usual. The main priority is to stop the attack on Syria. And nevertheless, people who should know better have allowed that to be crowded out and attention to be monopolized by some really rather feeble, lame, stale revelations by this pretentious character, Ed Snowden, attempting to profile himself as a bombastic, narcissistic culture hero in the model of Ellsberg and Assange. And he's telling us that there are wiretaps going on. Well, we knew that, didn't we? We knew that Bush had started with warrantless wiretaps. Based on what he's told us, this is now wiretaps on a very large scale, but with some kind of simulacrum of judicial process. Not that this makes any difference, right? We're against these wiretaps. Let's go on record. We're against such wiretaps. We've been fighting those all during the Audis when Ed Snowden was a warmonger, a bloodthirsty killer volunteering for the special forces to go and kill Iraqis. That's his story. So he's coming forward now telling us that there's warrantless, or actually warranted wiretaps, and that there's PRISM, so that they read your email in certain cases. Well, I kind of think we knew that already too. And he's told us now that the U.S. hacks into China. Well, we know that there's mutual hacking going on between the U.S. and China. And he tells us, how about a shocker, that the U.S. and Russia and the British spy on each other. Oh, I'm my breath is taken away. I'm going to faint. It's just such a shock. So we knew all this stuff, Ed. We want to know something new. Tell us something about 9/11, Ed, and you'll get our attention again. But as it is, you're simply a bombastic narcissist, probably with autistic overtones, strutting and fretting his hour upon the stage, and it's getting boring and old really fast. He is also, notice, an agent provocateur. He has already created crises with China because whatever goes on, right, in the hack world, the Chinese hack the U.S. like mad. The U.S. reciprocate in kind, or started, or however you want to phrase it. But once it's mentioned, then you lose face. And then that's the big thing, of course, in the Far East, right? The personal dignity, the question of face. And if you're losing face, then you got to do something about that. So this has the potential for real serious mischief. So I would urge the left libs, right? The people out there on the Democracy Now! Circuit, the people that are cooing and oohing over Glenn Greenwald. Norman Solomon has endorsed our dear friend Ed Snowden. Norman Solomon, remember him? It's interesting. All of these people, or many of them, are determined, bitter enemies of 9/11 truth. They can't stand 9/11 truth. Glenn Greenwald practices that same thing a slightly different way under the cover of the blowback thesis, right? That's his approach to it. It does occur, and it's a result of blowback, but that's really just the official story with certain variations on the theme. And remember that blowback is the official CIA explanation, and none other than Obama wrote an article in the Chicago Reader in 2001, 2002, developing this theme of blowback, right? That this is the comeuppance you get for imperialism. And this is, of course, what the left liberals really love. So the left liberals have swooned once again, as Mort Saul once noted. The poor left liberals, they have so few heroes, they have none. So any faker that comes down the pike, they're going to give their heart away. They're just an easy mark for anybody like looking like Assange or Ed Snowden. And then we have the libertarians. They're in heaven. Oh, the libertarians, it proves everything they thought. We're on the slippery slope. The black helicopters, the dictatorship is near. All the paranoid fantasies come out. Played on quite cleverly by Snowden, because Snowden sits there and says, guess what, libertarians, any little bureaucrat, any little apparatchik sitting in a cubicle can come along and tap your phone and read your email, and there's no warrant, and it can be anybody. Even the president is not immune. So the wild mode of exaggeration, the wild slippery slope that never was on land or sea. And all of this then leads to forgetting the main thing, and the main thing is the attack on Syria. You get that attack on Syria, you can kiss your civil liberties goodbye, and I don't care what Snowden is doing for you. Any fool can see that another round of war, and this time bigger, and actually with resistance people who can fight back and will fight back, this will lead to the destruction of any remaining civil liberties. So if you're really concerned about civil liberties, your number one task is stop the attack on Syria. Remember, every time that there's a new war emergency, that's when new liberticide measures, new totalitarian steps are implemented. And then, of course, in addition to that, any other progressive cause will be destroyed in case of war, right? Look at what happened to the United States during World War I with Woodrow Wilson, the police state that came out of that, the Palmer raids, the Espionage Act, the suppression of the pro-German feeling, right? The coleslaw has to be redefined as liberty cabbage and all the rest of that garbage. So we don't want that. The United States view of this is skewed a little bit because it didn't really happen quite so badly in World War II as long as Roosevelt was alive. But then as soon as it was Truman, then we got McCarthyism, right? So you get a huge anti-civil rights, anti-civil liberties backlash. So again, if you're concerned about those things, you should be out there stopping the war with Syria. And that means not attacking Obama per se, but attacking those forces that are associated with bringing the war. And that's not Obama. Obama is dragging his feet. He is reluctant. He is uncertain. He's vacillating. He's doing the absolute minimum to get by. And then you'll say, well, of course, but he has drones and assassinations and raids and all these other things. Yes, exactly. And that is, in the world that these people inhabit, that's an alternative policy. It's the difference between drones and assassinations of the kind we've seen now over the last 4 to 5 years, and on the other hand, the big battalions, right? The big 1-month air campaign with hundreds and hundreds of planes, and a lot of them shot down this time too, most likely, and maybe some warships sent to the bottom by those cruise missiles or God knows what. This could get really ugly really fast. So between the divine plan, right, what Obama goes with, the drones and this stuff with cyber warfare, economic sanctions, and so forth, between that and what McCain and the neocons are demanding, there is a huge gulf. So get that into your head. And if you don't want that big war, you better do something about it. And, of course, the people who are bringing the war, who are they? It's not Obama. Guess what? It's Cameron and Hague of England. You better find out who they are if you don't know. It's Hollande and Fabius of France. And if you don't know who they are, you damn well better find out. And, of course, McCain and Lindsey Graham, you probably know who they are. These are the amigos, right? And they have a whole clique and a coterie. And they're joined then by the extreme neocons. The libertarians, of course, are on the sidelines pretending that they don't like this. But it's really a feckless opposition. They could be doing so much more that they're not doing. It's a kind of a pro forma opposition. The people like Rubio and Rand Paul and Ted Cruz, they want to see Obama in a quagmire war because then they figure they can impeach him. Here's the reasoning on that. The Republicans would say that it was a mistake to impeach Clinton at the beginning, at the end of 2008, and then have the trial at the beginning of 2009. The Republicans would say it would have been better to wait until mid-2009 or even into the year 2000, do the impeachment then, have the trial more or less immediately. And the big difference would have been, at the time that they made this calculation, it would have been reasonable to assume that since Clinton was going to be dragged into the war in Bosnia with the bombing of Serbia, that there would be losses, and at that point, Clinton's relation to his own base would be wrecked, and that then the impeachment could have led to the actual removal from office. But as it was, since they went ahead with the impeachment, they drove everybody into supporting Clinton to the point where when he did attack Serbia, it didn't matter because people had already said, I'm supporting Clinton no matter what happens because of these damn fascist Republicans. I'm not giving them the pleasure of removing him from office. So this was a mistake. So now the fascist or Republicans are saying, let's wait until he gets himself destroyed. And as I've said before, Obama has now embraced the third rail. He's embraced two third rails. Obama has talked about cutting Social Security benefits with this unspeakable monstrosity called the Chained Consumer Price Index, and adding another $400 billion in Medicare cuts to reach the grand total of $1.1 trillion of Medicare cuts. So with that, he's weakened himself. Now, if he adds a war, he will be impeachment bait, and the Republicans can go all the way and consolidate their lunatic base with a successful impeachment. In other words, one followed by conviction, right, by removal from office in the United States Senate. Now, they don't have that now, but you'll be amazed what a war can do. So then, some more guidance. Now, my approach to this stuff, as you know, if you've read my books like 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA, without which really you can't understand any of this stuff, I try to provide you with a conceptual apparatus so that you can push aside what is normally known as information and develop a concept. I'm not dealing in information. This is not John Locke or Thomas Hobbes or Francis Bacon or Hume on the air. No, this is Platonic Leibnizian philosophy talking. And the idea is you need a concept. So the conceptual apparatus, for example, for state-sponsored false flag terrorism, is you're always looking for the pattern of the moles, the private network, the Wall Street network in our case, inside the government apparatus, which is essential for protecting the patsies and then for rounding them up. You've got to be looking for the patsies, these psychotics, fanatics, double agents, whatever they are, drifting individuals who are the Oswalds or the Attas of the case, and then the one that you don't see, the technicians, the people that actually can, as trained killers or trained technical people, bring about the effects that you see in something like 9/11. So the notion of the moles, the patsies, the technicians, that all of that takes place in connection with drills and exercises in an atmosphere of media control. This conceptual scheme has actually proven so powerful that it got itself into books, like Jonathan Kay, Among the Truthers, and so forth. And there was people who are fundamentally hostile to the analysis are simply forced to recognize the overwhelming conceptual power of that approach. Now, what I'll do in the next segment or two is to try to show you a way to identify a limited hangout operation, probably a CIA limited hangout operation, but anybody else's limited hangout operation, indeed going back to the Venetians, would look like this. So what we'll try to do is to have a comparison. Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. We'll then go on and look at Assange and WikiLeaks, and then we can look at Ed Snowden and his threadbare stuff, and we'll show what they have in common. And at that point, you will be educated to the point where you can identify a limited hangout operation. In other words, unless you're devoted to the idea of being a useful idiot for Ron Paul, Rand Paul, the Republican Party, or some other force. Back in a minute. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program here on Unbound Radio. As promised, we're going to use this rather short segment and then the next one, if necessary, to develop this scheme. How can you always tell a limited hangout operation, be it of the CIA, who do most of them, but others would also have the same pattern? And remember, the idea is I've taught you the moles, the patsies, the technicians, the use of the drills and the exercises. If you know that, you can figure out just about any of these false flag events or things of that type. But now we got something else. This is not violence. This is attempt to manipulate public opinion. The general idea with a limited hangout is this: you take a mass of carefully doctored, selected material. It's not a fair sample, and it's generally not really a revelation of anything, but it's a mass of mixed lies, truth, half-truths. Generally, you've got to have a kind of a crust of shocking truth on top to gain some traction and some credibility, but then that soon yields to really mediocre, low-level stuff with then things mixed in which represent what the issuing authority wants you to believe. Instead of just revealing it, you associate this with a rebel, right? Some person who's going to act out the role of the whistleblower, the defector, the courageous individual against this titanic bureaucratic machine. Ellsberg, Assange, and now Snowden, right? And with this, you can dupe large numbers of young people because of the eternal, Oedipal, anti-authoritarian, Rousseauvian impulse, right? That you don't want to bear the burdens of civilization. You don't want to listen to your father. You don't want to do what society expects. And therefore, you're sympathetic to somebody who seems to be a rebel, right? The eternal rebel without a cause. But in this case, it's rebel with a cause. It's this package of stuff. So the idea now is whatever this package was, this now becomes the hot news. This becomes the stuff, the hot sauce, right? You've got to find out what's in it. So again, Ellsberg, 1971, 72, Assange just recently, 2010, 2011, and now coming close on the heels, and it's dangerous to do so many. This is best done once in a generation or so that the generation can be duped once, but maybe not twice, but maybe they can, right, given the way things go. So it's dangerous to do it again so fast. Now, here are a couple of things. The first point is, if it's a limited hangout, the limited hangout protagonist, the limited hangout hero, if you will, immediately becomes a media darling. Immediately. And this can even be done preemptively, right, before the fact. We go back to Daniel Ellsberg. What do we have? The Pentagon Papers were photocopied with the help of Senator Kennedy, certainly not, the anti-establishment figure, and then they were published in the New York Times, and then when an injunction was issued against them, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and it's like banned in Boston, right? If it's banned in Boston, you've got to find out what it is, right? This was the best way to get a novel sold in the 19th or early 20th century, right? If it's racy and risque, then it's going to be banned, and then you got to get it, right? It's like, triple X. Got to find out what's going on there. So the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, but eventually it was a consortium of 17 corporate newspapers, and they fought it to the Supreme Court and defeated the Nixon administration. Now, if you have had anything to do with Kennedy assassination research against the Warren Commission, or most likely against the 9/11 report, right, the Kane-Hamilton Commission, if you've been fighting the Warren Commission and the Kane-Hamilton report for any length of time, you know that this is not what happens to you if you are the bringer of messages that the establishment does not like. If the establishment doesn't like you, they will not put you on the cover of Time magazine like Ellsberg and Assange. They will vilify you and slander you and maybe bump you off, but you will not become a media celebrity on this instant basis. So that's the most obvious, right? Any fool should be able to see that, and we'll have more in just a minute on the Webster Tarpley Program of Unbound Radio. Back in a minute. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program, Unbound Radio. Apropos of nothing, there is no New World Order and one world government. No, there's no such thing. You look at what's in front of your nose right now, you'll see a clash between NATO on the one side and Russia on the other. And it's practically at the level of warfare. In other words, there's a proxy war going on inside Syria between the Syrian army, Hezbollah, and those are proxies for Russia, and the Al-Qaeda death squads acting as proxies for the U.S., the British, the Israelis, and the rest of NATO. So this entire slogan, New World Order, One World Order, this completely misleading, and it's been a disaster. I think it was invented by Cleon Skousen of the Mormon secret political police, right? The Danites and Shenpips, out there in Salt Lake City, right, trying to obfuscate what's going on. Anyway, our task right now to develop this typology of the controlled hangout, right, the limited hangout practiced by intelligence agencies. So, number one giveaway, the limited hangout artist is an instant media celebrity. In the case of Ellsberg, he gets it in all these 17 top newspapers. In the case of WikiLeaks, Assange has got this pre-constituted media cartel. The New York Times, the London Guardian, El País of Madrid, Spiegel of Hamburg, and Le Monde of Paris. And he's got, in addition, in the Washington Post, Cass Sunstein, totalitarian figure, sometime official of the Obama White House, husband of Samantha Power, now headed to be the resident U.S. Viper at the United Nations. So Sunstein writes his article, Brave New Wiki World, Washington Post, February 24th, 2007, and he's touting WikiLeaks to destabilize China. And what I'm trying to point to is that Ed Snowden is in all likelihood the redirecting of the WikiLeaks anonymous and related stuff back towards the original target after doing the Middle East caper, right, the Arab Spring, back now towards attacking China. And I think this is the goal of having Snowden in there. He's going to become, if you will, some kind of a focal point for sort of autistic-minded cyber resistance on the part of the young dupes of China. And you see this has already started. Okay, and so that's the media aspect. Now, of course, with Snowden, he's all over the place. A couple of days last week, he was getting like half of every hour, one third of every hour at least on CNN, and so on down the line. In other words, he's everywhere. And it's even interesting that what he says is reported without really featuring that he's the one saying it. It just says, it's now reported that the National Security Agency has tapped into the secret emails of government people at these conferences. All right, so instant media celebrity. Now, the second point, the limited hangout contains almost nothing new, almost nothing you didn't know. You can read about this stuff. I've got an article. It'll be up on tarpley.net by, if not Tuesday the 18th, and by Wednesday the 19th at the latest. The limited hangout has almost nothing new. In the case of the Pentagon Papers, if you had been reading Le Monde, Agence France Presse, various Italian papers, you knew it all. There was nothing you didn't know out of the Pentagon Papers. Now, of course, what had been done with the help of Morton Halperin and Leslie Gelb was that this story had been massaged to make it look like politicians are all bad, especially Kennedy is really bad. The Army is very bad, U.S. Army very bad, CIA gets whitewashed. Forget about Operation Phoenix, mass assassinations by the CIA, and forget about drug running by the CIA, and so forth. So it's a very smelly package. And again, there were some people who didn't want to go with it, but then Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn came out there to praise it, and their careers were made. And somebody like Mort Sahl, the comedian, who is still alive, interestingly enough, who was a supporter of Garrison. He wanted the truth on the Kennedy assassination. He was a big critic of the Warren Commission report. His career was over. And if you look at Morton Halperin and Leslie Gelb, their careers also soared. So anybody who pushed and supported the Pentagon Papers, their career was favored by the establishment. If you were against it, then you got nowhere. With Assange, it's similar, right? He's all over the place. Notice that Assange comes out first with that very, very shocking film of people being machine gunned by a drone or other air asset. But of course, that was already known, right? That incident had been reported. People knew how many. You just never seen it, and of course, seeing it is a different story. So, in the case of our dear friend Snowden, well, I've just been through it, right? We're told There's warrantless wiretapping, but now with warrants. Fine, we know that. There's PRISM. They read your email. We knew that. They great powers spy on each other at international conferences. Yeah, we knew that. And the U.S. hacks China. Yeah, we knew that. So what's new? There's nothing new. Now, the area where more information would really be welcome, of course, are the really big covert operations. And we can just focus on two. The Kennedy assassination, which defined the whole 15 or 20-year period thereafter and really beyond, Vietnam War era, and now the 9/11 attacks and the global war on terror. We've learned almost nothing about these. They're almost never mentioned. And in the JFK case, when you get to the Pentagon Papers, it never happened. I mean, the Kennedy assassination almost is a non-event. It's just never really appears in any systematic way. There's a great desire to get away from it. Anything that had to do with the Kennedy assassination has obviously been expunged, hasn't it? Yes, it has. And even at that rate, 1967, you might expect even something about the Roosevelt assassination, right? The poisoning death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1945, where Stalin told his son, the Churchill gang killed your father with poison. These are the realities. But no, we don't get that. So with Assange, we get nothing about 9/11. What we get is Assange telling the Belfast Telegraph, I'm constantly annoyed that people are distracted by false conspiracies, such as 9/11, when all around we provide evidence of real conspiracies for war or mass financial fraud. And now we've got, Glenn Greenwald now, the sponsor of Snowden, big enemy of 9/11 truth, again, specialized in the blowback theory. Norman Solomon, big supporter, big touter of Snowden, and he's also a big foe of any inquiries into 9/11. So this is still an open question. Huh? If some people would get off their duff and stop following the Republican Party, Breitbart, Drudge Report talking points, we could actually tear down this entire figure of Snowden. In other words, expose Snowden as a triple agent. Snowden officially is NSA, CIA. Then he becomes a defector, maybe Chinese, a traitor, whatever you want to call him. But in reality, he's working for Langley. And as time goes by, that will become impossible to conceal. Another thing is the Damascus Road conversion pattern. The Damascus Road conversion is that somebody like Ellsberg was a complete warmonger, right? He was a Rand Corporation, Dr. Strangelove nuclear planner. He was involved with McNamara. He was working right in the same office with McNamara in the Pentagon. He was then in Vietnam with General Ed Lansdale. General Ed Lansdale is the ugly American. That's General Hillendale. That's Operation Phoenix, in effect, right? That's mass murder of anybody who can read and write, because if you can read and write, you're probably a communist. And then back to the Rand Corporation. So Ellsberg tries to describe a Damascus Road conversion. He says, I was at Haverford College in August of 1969, and I heard this guy saying that he was a draft resistor, he was going to go to jail, and he was going to be happy to meet all his old friends again in the jail. Well, and then Ellsberg rolled on the ground in the men's room, and then 1 hour later woke up and he was anti-war. So if you believe that, there's nothing I can do for you, right? You are suffering from terminal gullibility. In the case of Assange, it's a little bit different, of course, because his brain had been turned to mush very early on. He grew up in the coils of MK Ultra, the Ann Hamilton Byrne cult, where little kids got LSD, and so forth. Then he became a young nihilist, a nomad, lived in 50 towns, 37 different schools. Then he's hacking using the screen name Mendax. Mendax means you're a liar. Notice Snowden's screen name Verax, the truth teller. He tells the truth. That's smarter. Assange had a biological father, but his cyber father was John Young of Cryptome. And in 2007, John Young said WikiLeaks is a CIA front. Snowden, of course, $120,000 or $200,000 a year, college dropout, community college dropout, high school dropout, but nevertheless gets this money. He enlisted in the U.S. Army May 2004, wanted to join the Special Forces to free Iraq. Then he goes to he's a low-level guard, security guard at the National Security Agency at the University of Maryland, then CIA computer security in Switzerland, then private contractor for the NSA at a base in Japan, and then finally NSA at the Konya Regional SIGINT Operations Center. Medical leave for epilepsy, goes to Hong Kong, makes the revelations with the help of Greenwald and a certain Laura Poitras, Poitras, Poitras. And, of course, he's a Paul-tard. He's anti-war, ultra-austerity, libertarian, voted for Ron Paul. So Snowden starts off as a warmonger, but then he realizes, we got a Leviathan state, and we've got to do something about it. So this is also very fishy, very, very smelly. Snowden has remarkable timing. His first reports come out the same day that Qusair fell. The military crisis of the death squads began in grand style. On the same day that the G8 begins, he's got revelations about that. He's got everything, sort of timed perfectly. And again, most of it's trivial. But then the real thing, the covert operations of our time have been largely prepared by precisely these limited hangout operations, right? The Pentagon Papers is a big leak. Henry Kissinger goes to Nixon and says, we've got to do something about the leaks. Nixon creates the plumbers. Who's in the plumbers? CIA legend Howard Hunt, CIA communications expert James McCord, FBI thug Gordon Liddy. Then along comes Bob Woodward, fresh from the Office of Naval Intelligence with a top secret security clearance, and he begins writing about it in the press organ of the Federal Reserve System, the Washington Post. And that then leads to the Watergate affair, right, which is the big attack on the institution of the presidency, far more than just Nixon. But again, the anti-authoritarian Oedipal impulses are brought into play. In the case of Assange, remember, no U.S., British, or Israeli politician was ever damaged. No covert op of any of those countries was ever exposed. But the list of targets is the same as the CIA's enemies list. Ben Ali of Tunisia, Gaddafi of Libya, Mubarak of Egypt, Saleh of Yemen, Assad of Syria, Maliki of Iraq, Karzai of Afghanistan, Berlusconi, Kirchner, Putin. You get the picture. And we'll be back in a minute on the Webster Tarpley Program. Welcome back to our final segment here on the Webster Tarpley Program on Unbound Radio. This has been our program of Tuesday, the 18th of June, 2013. And, of course, we are fighting for rights, and we're fighting for economic rights. Don't forget those. Since 1944, the great pending business has been the anchoring in the Constitution of Franklin D. Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights, right, where you have a right to a job, to a home, to medical care, to education, to retirement, to freedom from monopoly competition as a small businessman, to a parity price if you're a farmer, and so on down the line. So don't forget those. And tyrants can also come in the garb of libertarian leprechauns in the world that we live in. So we've gone through. You can tell a CIA limited hangout operation if the protagonist immediately becomes a media darling with all the fawning news media immediately lending themselves to the propagation of this stuff. If there's really nothing new about anything, and in particular, if there's nothing whatsoever about the main covert operations of the age, and even an express hostility to that of the kind that we see with Assange personally, or Glenn Greenwald, or some of the other backers that have attached themselves to this, like Norman Solomon, And then we've also got the idea that covert operations are being created, right? So in the case of the Pentagon Papers, it's Watergate. In the case of Assange and WikiLeaks, it's the Arab Spring, the destabilization of all these countries, not just in the Middle East, right? Because there was the ouster of Berlusconi came off this. There was an attempt to have a color revolution in Russia. Thank God that failed, but they tried it, and they're still doing it. Now, we're sitting here looking at Ed Snowden. What covert operations are going to be spawned by his routine here, right? His number that he's prancing around, purporting to carry out. Well, you can see one of them is to dupe and neutralize anti-war opinion in the United States, not even just to dupe them and neutralize them, but to get them to attack Obama as if Obama were the main bringer of war. This is absolutely fatuous. This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Remember, there's no greater sign of idiocy and naivete than to assume that the president automatically has power, or that whatever happens is because the president has willed it. No, it's generally the other way around. You've got to prove that the president did it in order to exonerate the permanent bureaucracy, the palace guard, the rogue network, of course, that's been there for, this 125-year period, since around the time of Grover Cleveland. We actually ought to have an anniversary of that from year to year, and maybe we can work that out, right? The day when Grover Cleveland signed the U.S. public debt over to Morgan and to London is the birth of the U.S. rogue network, of course, always closely connected to London. So Snowden has already accomplished that, right? He has substantially diminished the anti-war opposition. And this may go all the way to a regional war in the Middle East and to a world war. Won't that be nice? Hey, left liberals, hey, libertarians, you can really pat yourselves on the back with that one, that your vigilance and your relentless desire to be duped and to be useful idiots was able to prevail under these conditions. Now, the other thing has got to do with China. At the level of governments, you can see that Snowden has already increased the tensions between the U.S. and China. He's also increased the tensions, certainly at the Northern Ireland Summit, because everybody knows that the same British spy operation, that's the GCHQ of Cheltenham. If you'd never heard of them, I think I talked about them here last week. Well, now you see them on the cover of The Guardian, right? And, of course, The Guardian is the flagship, right? It's the Washington Post of Watergate. We have the Guardian of Ed Sanders, Guardian, Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, and their new star, that's Ed Snowden. So at the level of the governments, U.S., China, U.S., Russia, the whole crew really at that G8. And then at the level of destabilization, you notice that there's already there's a kind of a movement of dupes. These are now Hong Kong dupes who, they're obviously full of resentment against their own government. They want to orient themselves towards Snowden as their hero of internet freedom for China. So he's got an immediate following of dupes inside China. He may have an immediate following of dupes inside Iran and so forth. People who are so focused, again, autistic. They're focused on their internet privacy and the world be damned, right? If 50,000 people starve to death every day, who cares? If we're on the brink of a big war in Syria, who cares? So I'm urging you, don't be a useful idiot. Don't fall for this stuff. Don't join the zombie legions of Ed Snowden, but keep your eyes on that Syria war and do whatever you can to prevent that. We'll see you next week on the Webster Tarpley Program, Unbound Radio. Revelations by this pretentious character, Ed Snowden, attempting to profile himself as a bombastic, narcissistic culture hero in the model of Ellsberg and Assange. And he's telling us that there are wiretaps going on. Well, we knew that, didn't we? We knew that Bush had started with warrantless wiretaps. Based on what he's told us, this is now wiretaps on a very large scale, but with some kind of simulacrum of judicial process. Not that this makes any difference, right? We're against these wiretaps. Let's go on record. We're against such wiretaps. We've been fighting those all during the Audis when Ed Snowden was a warmonger, a bloodthirsty killer volunteering for the special forces to go and kill Iraqis. That's his story. So he's coming forward now telling us that there's warrantless, or actually warranted wiretaps, and that there's prisms, so that many of them are willing to go along with obvious covert operations, obvious frauds, because these are somehow designed to cause trouble for Obama. And there are lots of them, Benghazi and others. And now we've got Ed Snowden, the new hero, the new culture hero for the millennials and for the aging boomers and for any silence that are around. Ed Snowden. So we're going to demystify this today here on the Webster Tarpley Program, Unbound Radio, back in just a couple of seconds after the break. Welcome back to the Webster Tarpley Program. So we're talking about the world strategic situation as usual. The main priority is to stop the attack on Syria. And nevertheless, people who should know better have allowed that to be crowded out and attention to be monopolized by some really rather feeble, lame, stale question. So what are you doing about that? And have you allowed yourself to be diverted by the latest covert operation? And this is the tragedy of the current situation, is that starting around 9/11, we had a body of opinion, we had a body of broadcasters and other people trying to shape public opinion who could be relied on to oppose the covert operations that came down the pike. Unfortunately, a lot of those, tragically, were sucked into the Rand Paul reactionary, proto-fascist Republican machine. And as a result of that, they are intellectually, morally crippled, politically crippled, to the point where there are now many covert operations which they are willing to approve, to support, right? The Benghazi stunt to begin with. In other words, the hatred of Obama has grown to be so consuming. It's going to start. Remember the infamous bombing of Serbia in 1999, ordered by Al Gore in a kind of a palace coup. And as I said, we're trying to figure out what happened there with Libya in 2011, around the middle of March 2011, when the word from Washington was no, 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 and then somehow it became, yes, let the bombing begin, and Sarkozy was way out in front jumping the gun. Very suspicious case. So you're now on the verge of something much worse, believe it or not, than any of that. A glance at the proceedings in Northern Ireland over the last couple of days, the meeting of the Group of Seven, Group of Eight, the Group of Seven Western countries, NATO, U.S., British puppets, what have you, and then, of course, Putin being there providing the antidote. If you look at that, look at those proceedings, you will see that the entirety of world politics currently aligns around this Syria. Welcome to this week's edition of the Webster Tarpley Program, and that is yours truly, Webster Tarpley, speaking to you from Washington, D.C., and as soon as this music quiets down, if that's what we can call it, we'll get on to our strategic briefing of the week here on Unbound Radio. And the principal question, of course, is what should you be doing? How should you be mobilizing, right? Not sitting in your easy chair or squatting vulgarly outside of the universe of discourse, but what to do. And it comes down to something very simple. The principal priority right now is one. It is to stop the attack on Syria, to prevent the imminent U.S. war with Syria. And this is a war which could be ordered by Obama, or let's be frank, it could be something that takes place without Obama even knowing